I don't think we could have a better speaker and certainly not a better friend to Liverpool Green Party. So welcome, Natalie.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone who's come along. And it's lovely to be back in Liverpool, if only virtually. It was, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks ago. I lose track now that I was there for the big march against the arms fair. And I'm sorry we didn't manage to stop it. We certainly made plenty of noise. And indeed, I was in the House the next day or two later, commenting, particularly looking at the government, talking about the policing bill and saying, we were in Liverpool making lots of noise, which saw a few winces. That was all terribly good fun. So when I was asked what I wanted to title a talk about COP, I picked on The Future Is Now, because I think this is the first COP, and I've been to 4 other COPs. If you count Paris was the first one. I wasn't on the inside in Paris, but I was there in all the marches, and I was there with the excitement when we got the target of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And that was a really unusual COP, Paris in 2015, because it actually got a better result than anyone had been expecting. And at that time, people thought generally 1.5 degrees was a bit of a sop to the small island nations. It was like, Fiji and the Maldives and Tuvalu will try and rescue you. But what's now patently obvious is that was an absolutely crucial decision, because 1.5, whether it's the state of the oceans, whether it's the state of the climate affecting all of us now, what we have is 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And we can already see the massive impacts this is having on people's lives, having on nature. And of course, we're talking about exponential growth in impacts. And since COVID, we've all learned a lot about exponential graphs and what they look like and how dangerous they can be. So I went to Paris, I went to Marrakesh by train, which was an interesting experience. It's a great fun journey. I recommend it one day if you can manage it. And then in Bonn and in Katowice in Poland. And in all of those, there was still in the background the kind of shadow of the climate change deniers. And yet we're now in a situation where that's really not an issue anymore. In fact, I don't know if you saw it, but there was a story around this morning, the Global Warming Policy Foundation. That's Lord Lawson's lot, with whom I've sparred many times over the years, utter straight out climate change deniers. You might say they've seeded the field. They actually this morning changed their name, changed their Twitter handle, and they're now Net Zero Watch. So that's something to watch out for. But it really shows that this COP is happening not just in a situation where climate deniers no longer have any kind of place, but also that there really is a general widespread acceptance across right the field of politics that we need climate action to happen. And for anyone who joined us not right at the start, I was talking about how today the government in the Skills and Post-16 Education Bill has actually put in a provision saying LSIPs, local skills improvement plans, have to include recognition of the need for climate skills to tackle the climate emergency, both adaptation and mitigation, and also the nature crisis. So that's a really positive frame for us to be conducting COP in. But anyone who's thinking, right, we're going to come out of this COP the same way we did out of Paris, with some great big smashing conclusion and a real sense that we've made a ginormous step forward and we've done what needed doing, I think it's important to recognise that really is not how the COP process works. And I think as we went through in the years after Paris, we recognise that this is a continual ongoing process. And even doing things like making one big decision about 1.5 degrees in Paris has to be followed up, has to be worked on, details have to be decided. And so this whole thing's a process. So those of you who are perhaps a bit older on the call will still remember Copenhagen, which was COP15. And then I was a journalist working for the Guardian Weekly then, and we felt like, oh, Copenhagen, it had just failed. And there was a couple of years where the whole climate movement was really downcast, really struggled to get any sort of traction or notice at all. That really, we can't afford to have that now. And I don't think it will happen now. Whatever actual outcomes we get out of COP, this is part of an ongoing process, and it's accelerating at considerable speed. although of course we all know it has to go very much faster. So to pick out some of the sort of key main points, discussion points, and I'm aware I always believe that dialogue's better than monologue, so I'll try not to talk for too long because I'd much rather answer questions and address what people want to address. But there's a whole lot of sort of acronyms and terms, and I'll try and sort of trot through a few of those to just set the framework. And the first one of those, and in some ways the sort of core framing acronym, is NDCs, Nationally Determined Contributions. And what was unusual about the Paris process was that basically because everyone knew that President Obama couldn't get a binding legal target through the US Congress, countries have to say what they're going to do to cut their total greenhouse gas emissions. But that's a voluntary offer, which is audited, which other countries look at, but that's the NDC. Now, I've talked a lot already about 1.5, and one of the hashtags is 1.5 to stay alive. But if you add up all of the nationally determined contributions around the world, you actually get to 2.4 degrees. But one of the things that was agreed in Paris is there's what's known as the ratchet mechanism, which is again in the jargon of COP is what they call enhanced ambition. We have to keep bidding for countries, and countries are expected to keep improving and improving and improving their targets. And if you think about some of the things that have happened in recent years, we're now in a situation where, for example, for electricity generation, new solar and certainly onshore wind is in nearly all of the world as cheap or cheaper than any other new form of electricity, including coal. And in some parts of the world already, and very soon the rest of it, will be in a situation where new solar and onshore wind will actually be cheaper even than putting coal into existing coal plants. So the technology has kept moving on much faster than anyone thought, and the price of the technologies, some of the key technologies, has kept moving down. And the fact is that actually in electricity generation, we pretty well know what we need to do. Where the big gaps are and lots of the attention needs to be paid is on transport, particularly on land use, and also on home energy efficiency, which the UK is particularly bad. But so we've got that ratchet mechanism. We've got most countries in the world have put forward new NDCs, but we still haven't had them from China or India, although China encouragingly has set some pretty good targets in terms of pulling out of coal and seeing its end of its emissions rising. Because of course, everyone talks about China as the world's largest emitter, but when you look at it on a per capita basis, it's still very, very far below lots of other countries. And there's also the point, of course, that these figures are the emissions on your land. A large amount of China's emissions are actually to produce washing machines and plastic toys and lots of other things for us. And there is increasing movement, and certainly the Independent Committee on Climate Change in the UK that was created by the 2008 Climate Act, it is trying to get the government to move towards actually measuring the emissions that we use, the products we use, the emissions from them, rather than just simply looking at what we emit here. So you will hear, and I hear endlessly, and I have to prevent myself from thumping my forehead on the bench in front of me, the government going, oh, the UK has dropped emissions by 44%, better than any other major economy. Of course, we've exported quite a lot of those emissions by stopping manufacturing things. So the real figure is less than half of that when you count that. And if you look at Carbon Tracker, which is a very respected international NGO body, it says that the UK's targets are in line with our share of 1.5 degrees. But as Carbon Tracker quickly points out, our policies are not. And this might be said to be a classic Boris Johnson thing. Hey, we've made all these promises, we just haven't worked out how we're going to deliver them. And there's lots of interesting things to be said about the utterly inadequate hydrogen strategy, the fact that we still haven't got a heat and building strategy, and the Green Homes Fund was, of course, the great disaster of last year and earlier this year on that score. So the whole NDCs and nations delivering their cuts in emissions is one thing. One of the other really big things that you're going to hear a lot about at COP is climate finance, because way back in the day, the global north, broadly speaking, agreed that it would find $100 billion a year for the global south, because if you take India, if you take many countries in the global south, there are still a huge numbers of people who don't have access to any electricity at all. And that means, there's no light for the children to study once the sun goes down. There's not the basic provision needed for the hospital to run even the most basic hospital facilities. And, if the generator runs out, then the hospital is very deep in trouble. There are obviously lots of places that need electricity, that need other kinds of resources and inputs. And climate finance is one of the ways to provide a significant amount of that. It's basically about $20 billion short. And Germany and Canada are two of the countries that have been tasked with working on that. And the US did make a bit of an announcement on that recently. On this sort of negative ledger side of this, we have, of course, the situation where the UK government horrendously has slashed international development aid. And we just saw, I think it was the Observer front page on the weekend, Rishi Sunak's now going to try and count money given to the IMF as international development aid, which just is no way in line with international norms. And that's a real problem for us as chair of COP. And interestingly, I did a few months back, I did an event with the International Museums Association with Mary Robinson, who you might recall used to be Irish president, and he's chair of the of an international council of elders, which I think was founded by Nelson Mandela, certainly very closely associated with Nelson Mandela. And she said to me very clearly, a message to take back to the British government, tell them they've got to do better on their domestic policies if they're going to have real weight as the chair of COP26. And that's a message I've delivered in the House half a dozen times and done my best to get that across. So those are a couple of the big issues. How's the UK government playing it? And I have to say that, Alok Sharma is not perhaps a global name, but I think there has been an awful lot of work. He has done a lot of work on being the effective chair. And the UK has come up with a 4-word slogan for what they're trying to achieve in practical terms out of COP. So that's coal, cash, cars, and trees. I bet someone in the department somewhere spent a lot of time trying to find a C word for trees, but they obviously failed. So we got 3 C's and a T. But that's starting out with coal, and the idea is to consign coal to history. The G7's pledged to end direct support for coal by the end of 2021. They're trying to do that with the G20, although of course, since that includes Russia, China, and India, it's a challenge. I would say that the problem with the coal target, as necessary and obviously important as it is, and it is worth saying, coal is a huge issue in terms of air pollution and causes massive numbers of deaths through health issues associated with air pollution. So there's so many arguments on coal basis, but because the focus has been on coal, we haven't seen nearly the focus we should have seen on natural gas. And natural gas is a fossil fuel. It's not any kind of bridging fuel. It's not any kind of solution. It also has got lots of problems about a price attached to it, as we're seeing right now. And there's a sort of phrase, fugitive methane, because what's still not been properly charted, but the more it's charted, the more disturbing it is gas production all along the way has leakage associated with it. And that's leakage out of gas wells, but it's also leakage from the pipes along the way. And the levels of methane in the world are far higher than anyone can really account for. And this is particularly an issue because methane only stays in the atmosphere for much shorter than carbon dioxide, around about 20 years or so. But it is, as a global warming gas, 26 times stronger than carbon dioxide is. Fine, but we should have gas as well. Cash, I've already talked about the climate finance. With cars, the UK is saying that we should have a 2040 deadline for sales of fossil fuel cars. I think what's interesting is this is one, as in quite a number of areas, where industry is going faster than governments are. And we're seeing a real shift over in the major manufacturers shifting towards electric. And I think we'll see, most of that target will be met in most of the world far earlier, because once you start the shift, no one wants to buy a fossil fuel car anymore, and they're gearing up all the factories to produce electric cars. So the change will happen, I think, very quickly. What we want to say as Greens, and what practically no one else really says, is that we're not talking about a one-for-one swap between fossil fuel powered cars and electric cars. I mean, one of the many arguments of why we can't have that is the fact that if you look at the air pollution, particularly the particulate matter pollution, which does enormous damage to people's health, the very fine 2.5 particles that get down deep into people's lungs and indeed even into bloodstreams. About half of that comes from tyres and brakes. Now, of course, electric cars have tyres and brakes just as much as do fossil fuel cars. So electric cars don't solve that problem. They also, of course, an electric car takes up exactly the same amount of space on the road as does a fossil fuel car. You have huge problems with congestion. That means the people who really need vehicles to get around can't get around in them, and they just sit there in fumes. So, one of the real messages we've got to get out about cars is we're not talking about a one-for-one swap. We're talking about what's known in the shorthand as a modal shift, that around cities, shorter journeys, walking and cycling are it. And there should be a small number of electric cars. Ideally, the model should be a car club type model, whereas, when you're a student moving house or something, you rent a car for, from your car club for 6 hours, something to move your stuff. And that's, you use a car when you really, really need a car, and you find other ways of doing other things. And then the fourth one is trees. And the government's call is to call time on deforestation. And someone had a lot of fun calling it, they've got a leaf coalition that they're trying to, LEAF, they're trying to get countries to sign up to. All of which is very well and good, and we know that trees are important. There's much more to storing carbon than trees, and actually I'll put a little advert in here for Green Party conference, because on the Saturday night I've got a panel talking about what I'm calling the forgotten 70%, the 70% of the earth that's covered by oceans. And one of the speakers on that will be talking about seagrass, and seagrass is actually an even better storer of carbon than forests. And so we need to get beyond trees and think about the natural world more broadly. But we've also got to be really careful, because the government, when they're on the benches opposite to me, do love to propound on the subject of nature-based solutions to the climate emergency. Now, nature-based solutions are, of course, what we certainly need to care for nature for all kinds of reasons, for climate, but also our state of nature, the collapse of the natural world, the loss of biodiversity. We are now in the 6th great extinction, and that's unavoidable. Those are all big issues, but the government likes to go, well, this is how we offset our emissions. And it is really important to say that offsetting is a con. It's not a case that we can keep pumping out the carbon dioxide or the methane and plant trees and they'll soak it up and that'll be fine. We have to both slash the emissions and plant the trees. It's not an either or, we need to do both of these things. And so they really can't be seen as a trade-off. So that's a bit of an outline of kind of what's on the agenda, what the government's saying, what some of the big issues are. A couple of things I'll just mention before we go to the Q&A, and do feel free to, if a question occurs to you, feel free to drop it in the chat as we go along. It's I always find with these things that people have lots of questions right at the end, which is always a challenge. But what's missing, and I think what we really need to do to move the debate about tackling the climate emergency along, is as I was talking to the Minister, Baroness Barron, who's the one who made the changes to the skills bill. When we talk about green jobs, when we talk about the skills we need for the climate emergency, there's a great tendency to look at things involving hard hats and yellow reflective vests, and to think about home insulation, to think about installing renewable energy, even perhaps designing cycleways or better pedestrian routes. And all of those things, of course, we need. But there is a very dangerous idea out there that we can tackle the climate emergency with what I call business as usual with added technology. And so that's the idea that we can keep living much as we are now. We just find all these technological fixes to mean we're not emitting carbon while doing that. And the practical reality is that that just doesn't add up. And we need a great deal of what I call social innovation. And that means something the Green Party's long been propounding, the idea of a 4-day working week as standard with no loss of pay. Now that, to start off with, obviously there's a practical point there. If people are going to work and they are starting to go back to offices and workplaces again, those who've been working from home, and of course lots of people were never able to work from home. If you do that 20% less in a week, then obviously there's an immediate cut in emissions just there. But much bigger than that, and I think more important and more significant, if hard to measure, is the fact that if people have the time, the energy, the space to think about how they're living, to think about how their communities work, to help others, then you can actually have, I've got a saying, politics should be what you do, not have done to you. And, when I say that to meetings like this, particularly when they're in person, you can kind of very often see lots of heads around the room fall because people are thinking, where can I find time to do more politics? I've got my more than full-time job, I've got my caring responsibilities, and now you're asking me to do more politics or do more community activities. And if we create the space for people to do that, lots of the problems we face, communities can work together and solve them together. Universal basic income, I regard as a social innovation that's crucial for tackling the climate emergency. Because one of the reasons, there's many, many reasons to argue for UBI, but particularly from the climate perspective, one of the things that drives a huge amount of consumption is people feeling really insecure, uncertain about their income, uncertain they'll have enough money in future. So one of the things that people often do is they buy a bigger house because they don't really trust the pension system, but at least they can downsize that house later on if they need to. That'll give them some money to live on in retirement. And even more so, people feel like, the workplace is terribly competitive and maybe they sack the bottom 10% of performers every year, as some companies do. And so you have to be seen as the thrusting go-ahead side of person to be seen, be promoted, not be left behind. And that means you need to be wearing the latest fashion. You need to be, able to casually lean on the water cooler and say, oh, when I was on my long weekend in Dubai, I saw this and that and did this and that. And that kind of competition drives a huge amount of consumption. And if you take away the insecurity, take away the fear, then people can relax a bit, not feel the pressure to consume so much. And so that's why I think UBI is the kind of social innovation that we need. The other thing, so that's one, social innovation is really missing from the COP debate. The other thing that it's a more concrete thing that's lacking is the idea of, in the COP slogans, loss and damage. And this is a reflection of the fact that the people who are now suffering most, not by any means all, but most from climate disasters related to the climate change, the changing climate, are people in the global south, people who've done almost nothing to contribute towards the climate emergency. We have seen with fires in America and Australia and floods in Germany and other parts of Europe, it's starting to hit everywhere, but it is still, places like the Philippines getting flooded by hurricanes, Central and South America, lots of places are suffering. So loss and damage is the idea that they should be paid to help, particularly with adaptation, so that they can help keep their people safe, help if they need to build replacement infrastructure, build it in ways that's going to be durable in the current climate and future climates, etc. And this is, I think, is something the Green Party can particularly go big on, because it was either the last conference or the conference before we passed the motions, and I think this has to be regarded as a kind of reparations, because it's not just the fossil fuel damage, of course, or the climate damage. It's also the damage that's been done through colonialism and neo-colonialism, the kind of damage we've done to so many societies and structures, extractivist industries, massive environmental damage. All of those things are things that we've benefited from. We've got the resources. Where I sit now in the house, just down the road, is the Foreign Office. If you ever get the chance to go into it, do, because it's just the most amazing. The first time I went in there, I walked around and thought, this is where the wealth of India went. which is not absolutely 100% true, but it's certainly a reminder of how much we impoverished India through the colonial period, as in true of all of our colonies. So we need to tie that loss and damage and the reparations together, and we need to talk about all of that in terms of the global situation. So I think I've just about talked for half an hour, which is definitely long enough to look at a talking head on a Zoom screen. But before I'll finish, I'll just sort of wrap up with one kind of message that I think we as Greens have to kind of deliver at COP26, deliver all of the time, which is our emotion, the way we approach things has to be through hope. Hope is what gets people out of the bed in the morning. It's what gets people engaged, excited, involved in things. And hope is our emotion. Politics now is very much split between two sides. There's our side of politics and there's the far right. And you quite often hear people lamenting whatever happened to the centre. Well, centrist politics means leaving things much as they are now. And the public entirely understand that's not a viable option. That's no way forward. And so we're saying there's enough resources on this planet for everyone to have a decent life if we just share them out fairly. That's our foundational message of hope. What you have on the other side is the far right saying, oh, it's a difficult, dangerous world. You've got to be fearful and worried. So you've got to grab what you can for you and yours and shove those others away, whoever those others are. Build walls like Trump to keep them out, or try and put nets in the channel like Priti Patel to keep the few poor desperate asylum seekers, their boats from getting through. And so we've really got to be offering that hope and making that demonstrably true assertion that we can all have a decent life. We can restore our natural world. We can get back to living as Donut Economics talks about, the great book by Kate Raworth, for anyone who doesn't know it. Living within the donut, living within the planetary boundaries, but also meeting people's needs. And I was just having a discussion today. There are countries that are headed in this direction. And one of the great examples is New Zealand. New Zealand's treasury is guided by the Living Standards Framework. It's not chasing growth. It's not predominantly measuring GDP. It's looking at whether it's tackling poverty and inequality, whether it's giving people a decent life, and whether it's improving the state of its environment. And we need a treasury in the UK that's doing that. One of the interesting things is that both Scotland and Wales are on all of these measures, not doing nearly enough, but doing much better than England is. And the interesting thing is that both of those nations are, of course, far more democratic. They've got a proportional representation electoral system. They've got parliaments that pretty closely reflect the wills of the people. Of course, I do have to mention that we have Green ministers now in Scotland, which is a real landmark moment on these islands. It's quite, I haven't got around to saying this in the House yet, but I will one day. It's not tactful, but I will anyway, because there are now more Green ministers on these islands than there are Lib Dem ministers, which Lib Dems really won't like me saying that, but I have to say it because there's 2 Green peers and something like 68 Lib Dems. So it is worth making that point. But, what's the answer to all of these questions? My answer to everything ultimately is democracy. We need to make the UK a democracy. We need to support democracy around the world. We need to give people the power to make the good choices they will make when it's within their power to do so. So, a message of hope, a message of democracy, and a message of saying this is an ongoing process. So I'll finish there, and probably good time for some Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Natalie. Sally, do you want to take us through the questions that were sent in through Action Network?
Yes, we got a number of questions. Not everybody has obviously turned up, but I'll go through them anyway. They're quite a mixed bag, even though there's only a small number. So the first question, I won't read out names because we're recording, so everyone needs to remember that. First question is quite short. It just says factory farming of interest. So I take that as what you want it to be.
Yes, well, I think one of the probably most controversial areas you get around debate around COP, and certainly the Committee on Climate Change, the independent committee, advising the government on how it meets net zero targets, came up with a very modest and actually utterly inadequate account of, we need to cut meat consumption by 20%. I think I saw a figure actually in the last day or two that says that actually in the last couple of decades it's actually down 13% already. That was red meat, and that's happened kind of organically. Organically is an odd word in this context, but anyway. But yes, I would say the answer on meat is we have to end factory farming, and there's actually lots of reasons why we have to end factory farming. First of all, what I think will be the political, practical, biological issue that will be the most successful and the first to end factory farming is that I can quote the head of the British Poultry Farmers Association, who says we can't farm poultry the way we do now, certainly chickens anyway, without antibiotic use. And we have a huge problem with antibiotic resistance. In fact, I'm talking to a medical group about that issue on Thursday. And a few years ago, people might recall David Cameron actually made it the whole subject of a big speech when he was Prime Minister, the problem of antibiotic resistance. So I think that is what will be the first thing that will press through. But my other strongest, I think, argument about factory farming is that it's actually food waste. You take what's mostly perfectly good food that humans could eat, and you feed it to animals to produce a very small quantity of protein. And if you actually have humans eating that food, then any kind of problem we have in the future in terms of food supply effectively disappears. Half the arable land in the US is used to, arable being the cropland, is used to grow food for animals. If you stop doing that, then, and that means, feedlot cattle, factory farm chicken, and pigs. You stop doing that, then you've got a huge amount more food. You've also freed up lots of land that you can use for rewilding, for tree growing, etc. But of course, what you're doing, as well as producing that small amount of meat, is you're producing vast amounts of effluent. And that's a huge problem with nitrogens and phosphates polluting our waters. And we were talking a little bit about some of that earlier. Countries like Ireland, Northern Ireland, Netherlands, they've got so much factory farming now, they essentially have nowhere to put the, and I am going to use the Anglo-Saxon word because I had a crowd at the weekend chanting it, shit. There's just more than we can find any place to put. So that's one of the other reasons why we have to stop factory farming. So yes, end factory farming is my one sentence answer to that question, which I think I can pretty well guess what the question was meant to be.
The second question is, what can we do to make sure this summit isn't just a talking shop full of empty promises with zero actual change happening right now?
I'm really glad this question was asked, because I did actually do a similar event to this with Sheffield Green Party a couple of weeks ago with Professor Michael Jacobs from the SPERI, the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute. And it was interesting to hear what he had to say on this. It's always interesting to get another sort of non-party political view. And one of the things his message to Sheffield is get out on the streets, get out and be active. In my terminology, make politics what you do. And the middle week of COP, he was saying, he thinks is particularly important. So I'd say to people, it's pretty difficult to get to Glasgow, but if you happen to have a good friend in Glasgow who you could sleep on their floor or their sofa or something, maybe think about trying to get to Glasgow for what will be the big march that weekend. But perhaps more practically for lots of people is, get engaged in events all the time. It doesn't have to be immediately around COP, but that middle weekend of COP, getting really strong activity around that is particularly important. And it's a matter of just keeping the pressure up. I was talking about the importance of democracy, and it's like the whether it's trade union rights, whether it's the limited democracy that we have, all of these progress are not achieved by the people in power going, oh, it's about time we had a change, let's do that. These things are won. And so, it's within everyone's hands to make a contribution to winning a decent COP and to winning decent progress coming out of COP. So, I was just reflecting today, just down the road here on Parliament Square, I was out with the young climate strikers, and they were lovely, because one of the things about climate strikers, and obviously COVID has been a bit of a downer in slowing activity in that area down, but this was really the big reawakening, their first big climate strike and the one before COP. And there was a whole lot of new young people who'd never organised anything before. And it was just lovely to see how excited they were and how pleased they were that, they weren't quite sure, but this had all come together and it all worked out. And so having a go, just getting out there and doing things is really so crucial, so important. And, sometimes it'll go well, sometimes it won't go quite as well as you've hoped, but all of that contributes towards that story. And even, just talking to your workmates, talking to your friends at school or college or wherever, talking to your family, and getting across the message. I think it's really important to get the message across to people. And I think we've made a lot of progress in this in recent years, that, we have a pretty miserable life now. What we've done, we've trashed the planet and created a society with enormous levels of mental ill health, with massive insecurity, with huge amount of people relying on food banks. What we're talking about with tackling the climate emergency is also tackling all of our social crises. And that's, really obvious things, from like giving everyone a warm, comfortable, affordable to heat home, which would cut pressure on the NHS and end our disgraceful excess winter deaths. It means, I was talking a lot about tackling air pollution. The measures to tackle air pollution and climate pretty well 100% aligned. All of these things make people's lives better. So we've got to really get across the idea to people that this is about a better life. And one of the important things to talk about is just transition. We're talking about creating lots of opportunities for people, opportunities for small independent businesses, and the government talks about levelling up. I'd like to talk about spreading out. Thinking about home energy efficiency measures, insulation. There's jobs for every community in the land. There's small business opportunities for every community in the land out of insulation. I was once at a meeting with the Federation of Master Builders, and someone said, "Oh, but once we've insulated all of those homes, in about 40 years' time, we'll run out of work." And I'm like, if you're going to have jobs for 40 years, I think most people would take that as a good starting point. We can worry about that in 30 years' time. Thanks.
Okay, next question. Does Anna, our BSL interpreter, do you like a break now? Or are you okay to carry on? Should learn.
2 minutes.
2-minute break. Okay, is that all right with everybody? Okay, we'll see you all in about just before 10 to. Okay. I'll get a nice cup of tea in you.
Oh, we're back.
Yeah.
Oh, right, we're back.
Yes, there's good interim. Wait a minute, let me just set my view. There you go. Right, everyone ready for the next question?
Yeah.
So next question, what chance do we have in reducing CO2 when governments fund fossil fuel companies $11 million every minute? I think that's what you got. Yes, $11 million every minute.
Yeah, and I think, this highlights an important point, and something that I think is getting more and more traction. And if you look at what I said about coal being one of the government's targets in terms of the outcome from COP26, there often is a lot of focus on what we need to do. The renewable energy, maybe the home insulation, maybe the transport transition, but there's not a lot of focus on what we need to stop doing. And actually, this picks up some of the discussion that we were having in the break about people who say, "Oh, well, we've got to keep doing these fossil fuel things because it means jobs." Well, I think we're just about at the point, and I'm very much in the House now and generally running. Let's start to think about how we look at this, because there's the old traditional form. Oh, we've got to have jobs. We've got to have jobs. We've got to have jobs, and we have a huge shortage of HGV drivers. We have, I was couple of months ago now, one morning I did an event with the farmers, followed by an event with the builders, and both groups, the dominant message from the meeting was, we so need labour and we just haven't got anything like enough people to do the jobs we need doing. We have 100,000 people shortage of care workers. We have, last figure I saw, 40,000 shortage of nurses. We really need to turn this round and acknowledge that we actually have an enormous shortage of human energy, time, skills. And what we have to do is say, we've got to use those skills well. We've got to value those skills, pay them properly, treat them with respect, and acknowledge that we need to do the things that we need to do and stop doing the things we shouldn't be doing. I spoke before about just transition, and of course that means for some towns, it means a real turnaround. But actually being a one industry town is a really dangerous thing to be. I went to Barrow-in-Furness quite a few years ago now, and I was described as brave pretty well in every article in the local paper, and there were quite a few, because I went there to say, we shouldn't have nuclear submarines. But I said, it's also deeply dangerous for Barrow. I mean, at that point, they had about 7,000 jobs in the shipyard, all military-related jobs. And the next biggest employer in town was the big Tesco and the district hospital. And having all your eggs in one basket economically is essentially an extremely dangerous place for any community to be. So if we talk about the spreading out of prosperity, so many of the things we need for tackling the climate emergency are things that create different jobs, create different opportunities. But we have to get away from thinking we've got to do this to create jobs. We've got to get to thinking, what do we need to have done? How do we skill up, pay properly, ensure we have the right conditions so that the people who are available are able to do those jobs? There was some people may have seen, there was a fascinating Twitter feed from a guy who drives an HGV delivering milk for a major supermarket. And this was all around the HGV driver shortage. And it was absolutely fascinating because he started at 1 in the morning, finished at 4 in the afternoon. It was driving this enormous, very dangerous vehicle. He was backing it into, he had photos of all the places he was delivering it. He was backing it into spaces with about this much space on either side of an HGV. I couldn't even begin to imagine trying to do that myself. I'm bad enough with a little trailer. And was also physically loading and unloading the trolleys. And we think about the whole economic system we've got that demands people do those sorts of things. We haven't got the people to do that anymore. And we need to think about changing our systems. System change, not climate change, is a very old slogan. I actually had a letter in the, I think it was in the Sunday Times on the weekend with that slogan in there, which was quite fun. We need to get an entirely different kind of economy running, and we haven't got the skills or the people or the time or the energy that we need. We've really got to make sure it's all used well, and that's really a different way of talking about the job space.
Can I ask a supplementary on that?
Fine by me.
On a policy level, I totally agree. Having a town like Hartlepool totally dependent on steelworks or Barrow or whatever doesn't make sense, and it certainly doesn't make sense in terms of green policy. But I'm revealing my ignorance here. Does the Green Party policies cover what we say to individuals? Really, you're in. I heard some interviews with the coal miners in Australia who are all busily voting for whatever maniac is in charge at the moment, and they were just horrified at the prospect of losing their jobs in coal mining. What do we say to people like that to get them to buy into the idea and vote appropriately?
I mean, it's always going to be difficult to get, particularly knowing something about that Australian situation. People have been paid, because the mining industry went through a total boom period. People have been, paid. I've seen things like, people left teaching jobs to go and drive a truck in a mine because they were being paid 140,000 Australian dollars a year, which I I can't really translate that, but something like £80,000 a year or something like that. People have had windfall jobs. They're actually very rare, and they're a very small number of people. I mean, one of the things to say to people in that situation is, of course, the world is going to stop using coal. Your job is a very short-term job, no matter what happens. Why not get out now? But I think what we do is offer, particularly those kind of communities, is to say, what we're going to do is make sure there's decent security for every individual and every community. And that's where policies like a universal basic income, policies like a really decent minimum wage. The other parties like to talk a lot about social aspiration and social mobility, and we've got to have social mobility, which is the idea that a few people get out of a poor community and go somewhere else and get to rise up the job ladder, but that just leaves everyone else behind. What we need is every job to be a decently paying job, a respected job. We need bin people to collect the bins. We need people to sweep the streets. We need people to drive the buses, be the school dinner ladies, all of those kind of jobs. Every job should be a respected, decent job. And you should be, a 4-day working week is standard. Lots of those, mining type jobs, as Lias was saying in the break, they were actually pretty terrible jobs. Maybe they were well remunerated, but they were terrible jobs. We're, heading towards a society where everyone gets respect, decent pay, security, a decent work-life balance, not jobs where you get up at 1 a.m. and drive an HGV until 4 o'clock the next afternoon. We're looking at a different kind of model. And I fully accept that the coal miner driving a truck on £80,000 a year might be hard to sell, but I think there's a lot of people who can see that how much better their community would be in that situation where everyone's stable and secure and getting a decent income. And then what we're talking about is strong local economies where money goes round and round in the local economy, and that actually means communities are prosperous. And we've had a little bit of sign of this in what's known as the Preston model in the UK, where the local government started to say, well, we're going to give contracts to local companies. We're going to work very hard to support our local small independent businesses. You create that kind of model of an economy, and the money doesn't all go to Tesco, doesn't all go off to giant multinational companies who stash it in tax havens. Money stays in communities and goes round and round in communities, and that's when money's doing what it should be doing. So I hope that's a bit of an answer. Thanks.
Okay. So I've got one person gave 3 questions, so I've just picked out one. If we would need the others, I'll ask them. But I decided to go on with, what can we do to make healthcare green on a national and individual level?
Oh, that's an interesting one. That's not a question I get asked very often. I actually did there's something called the Westminster Forum, which is a little commercial operation, but they run some very interesting events. And actually this was pre-COVID, and we did a very interesting event on making healthcare green. And at that point, there were some really fascinating things, some people from the NHS, that they were actually looking to end nearly all plastic use in the NHS. And that was things that were at least like disposable gowns, gloves, those sorts of things. I mean, there is probably some level of plastics that's unavoidable in terms of sterility and stuff, and I don't think that's a problem. We can manage that. Obviously, COVID has been a huge setback to those efforts, particularly on plastic, but also, on emissions on healthcare. No one, understandably, has had the time or energy to do anything about that. And so we've had a real hiatus, and we're going to have to get back to thinking about the healthcare provision. But there's a huge amount to be done, and the structure of our healthcare buildings, I would include in healthcare also social care. And I apologise for that noise in the background. That means I'm going to have to go and vote in a minute, but that's all right. I will manage that in a second. I think there's a lot of people with goodwill. It's all been swept aside by COVID, understandably, and I think we have to cut them some slack and give them some recovery time before we start to try and put too much pressure on healthcare. But I think the other thing I'd say about sort of general climate and environment more generally and healthcare is that we've got to think about, and this is the foundation of green health policy, which is public health. If we can keep people healthier, and that means things like modal shift in transport, more walking and cycling, healthier food, if we can keep people healthier, then we need less healthcare. And that's the absolute best policy you can have on environment and all kind of other grounds. So what I'm thinking is that I might go in, because that must be really annoying, that background noise. Could you chat among yourselves for a couple of minutes and then I'll come back.
That's fine. Yeah, we'll let you go and do democracy in action. So has anyone got any more questions? I've got one more that what we've been sent through Action Network, and there's one from Mark Jazz, or two. So anyone else? I can see a hand up.
There's one from Sharon and one from Darren.
Ah, yes. Yeah. So one on bus services, one dinner lady. Oh, it must have been enjoyable being a dinner lady. I always loved my dinner ladies. They were our favourite people at school. Oh, Simon. Simon, you've got your hand up.
Would you like me to put it in writing, or do you prefer for me to ask already?
When we get round to everyone else, I'll make a note that we need to call on you.
Okay, yeah, I don't mind. Either way is fine for me. Just
cool.
Do I have a question? I think so,
Oh.
but I'm back anyway.
Okay. The final question we have from Action Network is, what is the Green Party going to do or try to do to help stop climate change?
Oh, okay. Well, I think in some ways I perhaps have already answered that, but I think the perhaps slightly unlikely answer to that is something that I kind of finished on in my main talk, which is countries that are more democratic in the world actually do much better on climate policies and climate outcomes. I've already mentioned New Zealand. If you look at the Scandinavian states, which have proportional representation, electoral systems, large amount of local democracy, strong local controls over activities. And there's an interesting one with Iceland. I once was at an event in Sheffield, and Iceland, which is basically more or less the size of Sheffield, actually has a president, a prime minister, a parliament of some 56 people, and it also has several score of local government areas, each of which have their own place in the constitution and do things like run schools and public transport. So I would say the top mainline answer to that is we will promote democracy, we'll promote the empowerment of people so people feel like they can go and make change for themselves. And that really is an absolutely core climate policy. And it means people get to decide what policies they have. And it's interesting, it sort of got swamped by COVID, but we had a climate assembly in the UK that was a fully run representative group of people from around the country getting together. And they came up with a whole lot of pretty radical climate policies, most of which the government hasn't instituted. And in France, they did a similar thing. And it's interesting, you might have heard that France actually has banned flights for train journeys of less than 2.5 hours. But actually the Climate Assembly in France said that should have been 4.5 hours, and it was the government that watered it down. So when you give people the information and the knowledge, the time to do deliberative democracy and think about it, you get really, really good outcomes. So more democracy, more empowerment of people. That's my top line answer to what we as Greens do about the climate emergency.
Well, Simon, did you want to come in on this?
If that's okay, because my question relates to this. So
okay.
I think it would be good time. Thank you. It's just, I completely agree. And being a French citizen, I was very frustrated to see that Macron chose not to implement any of that. But the tension that I can see sometimes is between the time it takes to do democracy properly, which is huge, and it should take a long time, and we should have that time, and the emergency of the climate and ecological crisis. So what is your response to people who say we don't have time for this, essentially?
I mean, the Climate Assembly in the UK, I don't know about the French one, but the Climate Assembly in the UK was done over a couple of months. So, you know, the time frame, you know, I mean, we have a totally dysfunctional, totally undemocratic government now, and it hasn't managed to produce a heat and building strategy in about, it's been promised for, I think we're up to 4 years. It's hard to keep track, but, you know, we have a government, and, you know, I'm at the moment very deep in the environment bill, and we had an exciting victory in that, and that we got soils as a priority area. It was the first time a Green amendment had actually been passed in Parliament, and we got soils through. I was talking to the Sustainable Soils Alliance, who are kind of the really key policy people, and they have produced this totally amazing diagram. It's like a sheet of A4, which makes a game of snakes and ladders look really simple. And it's all the things the government is supposed to be doing about soil. And there's strategies and plans and 10-point plans and frameworks. And then behind this is the 25-year environment plan, which said that by 2030, we'd be sustainably managing our soils. Now, that was agreed in 2010. What have we done about delivering on that you know, government promise? Precisely zero. So it's not like what we're doing, the undemocratic things we're doing now are actually delivering. So, you know, I think there's pretty good evidence to suggest that things that people are really signed up to, that people have really thought through, will do better in decision making than our current systems do.
Okay, I've got one from Mark in the chat, so I'll read it out. The government have some big carbon decisions to make after COP26, such as the Cumbrian coal field and the oil field Cambo off Shetland. What do you think is likely to happen post-COP? And shall I do the follow-up? If they choose to go ahead, what should we do?
Okay. Well, I think, I mean, we're going to have a real problem, and this is something that we can all think about, is there's a risk of a kind of letdown. Right, we've done COP. And, you know, the government will sort of go, well, we've done that, and they'll do their best to sell the result. And now it's time to move on to other things. And so, you know, in terms of directly what will happen about Cambo and what will happen about Cumbrian coal, Cumbrian coal, I'm mildly optimistic about. It's just so utterly indefensible that I think, you know, we might finally get the right result with that. Cambo oil, less so. You know, the answer is, what do we do about it? Is we scream, we yell, we take political action, we make politics what we do. And, you know, that's very, well, it's never easy or simple, and it has a cost. But if you look at, you know, some of the real examples of where non-violent direct action, if we get to that point, if that proves necessary, have been very effective, is the obvious example is the struggle against fracking, which many times over many years, people have told me, why are you fighting? And we just outlasted the industry. I mean, the earth, you know, anti-fracking protests can say we won. And that's one of the things that's really important for all of us to do as campaigners. Sometimes what we tend to do is, you know, we've got the government's given way on something, and people immediately go, oh, well, they've only given us 2/3 or 3/4 of what we really wanted, and that's not good enough, and we need better. I always really strongly urge people to say, if you've had a win, go out and celebrate that win, shout it from the rafters, because people need to know the campaign works. And so if you go out and celebrate victory, and then, you know, 3 days later you say, well, you know, we got 75% of what we wanted, but now we need to go and get the other 25%. That's the way to manage it, because otherwise people feel like we never win anything, so people feel like giving up. And, you know, the other great example of this was the Sheffield tree struggle. And this is, you know, really a perfect case study. You know, I was involved in quite a lot of that, on the ground with quite a lot of that. And, you know, we had some desperate days where lots of people were convinced, well, we've lost this, you know, they've found ways to keep arresting our people. We can't get there anymore, you know, without doing things that we won't do, like assault police officers. And, you know, we're really stuck here. But people kept going, people kept finding new creative ways to work. And what we have now is eventually in Sheffield is we now have a very good tree strategy. We have the council consults with the tree people on before they fell or do anything about every tree. And we saved some wonderful, historic, beautiful old trees. And we've now got a really good tree strategy. And we also helped lift the issue of street trees up to something all around the world. And one of the things I love about Sheffield trees was someone added me on Twitter saying they'd been inspired by what happened in Sheffield, and they'd started in New Delhi, India, they'd started a tree group. And, so that's a demonstration of how things spread all around the world. And, you get a lot of focus on the negatives of social media, but actually there's, it gives us lots of tools that weren't in our toolkit 20 years ago to share, to learn, to have a reach far more than you would have expected. I would never have expected Sheffield trees to get to Delhi, but they did.
Lily, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I do have a question. May I ask the question? Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
Natalie, when you're talking about trees, I am thinking, I don't know if you know that I'm the co-chair of the Southeast region now. And recently there was a by-election in Amersham, and we gave them quite a large sum of money to stand a candidate in the local elections, a Green Party candidate. And the thing is that in Amersham, you probably know, is where the HS2 is going through. And I wonder what the Green Party official line is on HS2, because I'm horrified that this is still happening. Even though we have Zooms now and people don't have to go to Birmingham for meetings, they can sit at home and do it on their computer. Why is anybody allowing this horrendous thing to go forward? And what are the Green Party actually going to do about HS2?
Well, I actually went, that was a parliamentary by-election, the Chesham and Amersham by-election, and I actually went to, it's known colloquially as Roald Dahl Wood. And I saw some of the tree felling that had taken place with our candidate. She showed me around. Green Party policy, as agreed at the I think it was 2012 conference, is opposition to HS2. That remains the policy. I will continue to go on saying that. Others go on saying that. There are some people in the party who hold a different view, but that is the party policy. And it has some of the most vociferous, its proponents are some of the most vociferous people on Twitter, and I'm well used to quite a lot of them, but I still tweet it, whenever anything particularly, and there's always, stories practically every week about, how disastrous the HS2 is being run, the disastrous environmental impacts, etc. So, we're there, we're opposing, we're doing what we can, and that's something I believe. I haven't looked at the details. I believe there will be some sort of debate about this at conference, but I haven't looked at the details yet. But so it's something that's likely to be to become under debate. I think if you look at the
can I ask something, because you are in a brilliant position to speak on behalf of the Green Party to the government. Is that an option?
Well, we do. I mean, Jenny leads on transport, so she's our primary spokesperson on this. But I'm afraid just us speaking to the government doesn't make any difference. We challenge them, we do those things, but we can't make them do anything. I mean, what I'd say is, I'm aware there are some people who are in the Green Party who are proponents of it. I think this is a bit like the debate about nuclear power, that people who think that we have to continue to have the hypermobility, we have to continue to have more mobility, so we have to do it the best way we can. They're the people who say, oh, we need nuclear energy, we need HS2, we need to get people off the roads. The kind of social innovation, the changing society, system change, not climate change, is where I think the Green Party should be, where the Green Party is, which says, we use less energy. The best possible energy you can have is the greenest, cleanest energy is the energy you don't have to use. And that's, why there is, I think, two different positions and where people come from. I'm just going to disappear again for a second and do another vote. Sorry, it's just the way of these things. It's unavoidable.
I have my own question, but is there any others? You can still raise your hand.
I would like to hear your question.
Yeah.
I'll wait till Natalie's here.
Given Natalie's been to so many COP meetings, I'd like to know more about it. You read in the papers that everything depends on the attitudes of the chairing person and the chairing government. And given the status of our government, with its total lack of any kind of moral compass, that in itself is grounds for despair. But I'm rather hoping that other countries, that picture of this conference as very much dictated by the chair is incorrect, and Johnson will come under real pressure to, well, actually say something definite rather than treat us to lots of woolly comments that go nowhere.
I think it's the Americans. I think the Americans claim a lot of credit of what happened at Paris. The French also claim credit, but the Obama people do actually feel like they were the people in the room getting agreements. So John Kerry actually, I think, is quite key. So, you know, and what he says actually really matters, probably a bit more than what our government says. So, and I'm assuming Joe Biden might turn up, because if that's what Obama did, probably Joe Biden.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I caught most of that. Yes, I mean, Biden has definitely said that he's coming. I mean, I think what will happen is, in many ways, the world will tolerate Boris Johnson and just go around him. You know, the key players really are the US, China, and the EU. And that's where, you know, the EU is a bit of a divided force, is not as strong as it was, say, in Paris. But nonetheless, you know, those are the key players. And, you know, if I just had a thought, we're a little bit like the Lib Dems. I'm sure we've all had experience of the Lib Dems where, you know, a local group has done this amazing campaign and had this great success. And then suddenly all these Lib Dem people appear out of nowhere with Lib Dems winning here signs and leap in front and say, we won it, we won it, we won it. You know, I think Boris Johnson will be behaving a little bit like that. And, you know, the world will just kind of shrug and let it happen, but just go on its own way in many ways. And, you know, I think one of the things is a lot of it is just hard, painstaking, line by line, comma by comma kind of work. And we do have, I mean, I've met some of them. We have a really good group of civil servants, a really good group of professional technical people working on a lot of that stuff. And that's an area where Britain does have some genuine strength, and we are able to make a contribution. So, you know, although some of the grandstanding is just grandstanding, we are doing some good things behind the scenes. And as I said, you know, I think Alex Sharma is doing a competent, hardworking, decent job and deserves a certain amount of credit for that.
Yeah, and has there been any movement since Copenhagen? Because in Copenhagen, the stumbling block there was the developing countries, the global south. They refused to move because the richer nations were refusing to give money and advice and support. So has there been movement on that this time around?
Well, I think, I mean, one of the key things is I talked a bit about the whole climate finance issue, and that's one of the areas where, and also, you know, loss and damage. And I think we will see a reasonable amount of move on climate finance. I'm less confident about loss and damage. But I think, you know, the practical reality is, and I mean, we saw this in Katowice. You know, the Fijians were really important in Katowice. And that was the Polish ones, which was 2 years ago. It all blurs slightly. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. It wasn't the most recent way. It's probably 3 years ago now. So, you know, they have an enormous amount of bully power, you know, particularly those small island nations that have essentially face disappearing. They do have a certain moral authority, and they also get a lot of support, you know, a lot of NGOs. Obviously, they don't have a huge amount of capacity themselves in terms of money and staff and resources, but they do get a lot of NGO support. So those small island nations in particular, but also the global south generally, when it gets together, does have a significant force at COP. And, you know, it is, unlike, say, the UN Security Council, the UN in general, you haven't got, you know, obviously big nations, China, etc., have power from their general geopolitical place in the world. But in terms of the actual COP structure, there is a certain flatness to it that's really quite a positive thing. That means those countries, and a really strong charismatic figure from one of those small countries can really emerge as one of the real champions that makes a difference at COP by, and it's also that really strange thing where people get to 3 a.m. and, they're being browbeaten by someone and they just go, oh, yeah, right. And sometimes that happens in a good sort of way. And, one of the things also to note about COP is, in my experience, it's supposed to finish on the second Friday. I've never seen a COP finish on the second Friday. I would be beyond astonished if it finishes on the second Friday. So expect it to drag on, because that's pretty well always what happens.
Yeah. I actually have a follow-up for that, but I do have another question. My follow-up was that John Kerry basically, I think, interviewing the Guardian, said that there will be some decisions at COP26, but there'll be others afterwards. Do you think that's primarily the case?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I started at the start by stressing this really is a process, and it's not an all or nothing thing where, it's a success or a failure, and that's what we're stuck with the next year or 5 years or whatever. The world has changed enormously in its attitude towards the climate emergency. The language has changed, even the actions changed. And so, COP won't be anything like what we need it to be, but it will make some progress, and that will be part of an ongoing state of progress. And so, it's not all or nothing. And, let's say we finish on the Sunday, work starts again on the Monday, to improve, to refine, to sort out what happened at COP.
Mm-hmm. Hey, my other question actually comes back to the Environment Bill. So what other good things are hopefully going to be in the Environment Bill, which we should be pushing our MPs to support?
You're reminding me that I will actually in a second dig up a link to the Green Party petition on the Environment Bill. There's 2 groups of things. There's a series of Friends of the Earth are pushing a whole list of amendments that are actually really important. 2 of the key ones are about the Office for Environmental Protection, which essentially is the body that replaces European regulation on so many things like protecting our habitats, protecting our wildlife, etc. And so there's the question of whether the OEP, sorry, I shouldn't talk acronyms, but it's late. The Office for Environmental Protection, whether it's truly independent or not, whether it's got the resources it needs and the independence it needs. And also, absolutely crucially, whether it's actually able to hold the government itself to account. So those are 2 really interesting and important, but not very sexy things. There's also what I think is terribly important, but deeply, deeply unsexy. It's being pushed by Baroness Brown, who's the Deputy Chair of the Committee on Climate Change. And it's to say that we should have interim targets in the Environment Bill. And, my vision is, a giant march down Whitehall going, what do we want? Interim targets, when do we want them now? Doesn't quite work as a theory, but the important point behind that is that the government can't just say, oh, here's our target for 2050, and we just go away, and at 2049 look at how we were going. You have to be showing continual progress the whole time. So it is actually important. And there's another thing which is a bit clearer and more obvious, known for shorthand as environmental principles, which is basically to say that particularly the military, but also crucially the Treasury, has to be bound by the principles of the Environment Bill. And so those are, they're all technical sounding and hard to pin down, but important. What the Greens, we're going to be pushing as Greens, is I've already mentioned my soil amendment, and that's saying that we must have targets for soil. We're also very much backing an amendment from the Duke of Wellington. I never get sick of saying that because it seems like such a strange concept. But anyway, he's a crossbencher and does some good things, which is basically water and sewage I was talking about before, saying that water companies have to keep on a path of continually improving the quality of our waters, our rivers and our seas. So there's water. And then there's amendments on air pollution, which set WHO standards for air pollution, which Jenny Jones, my fellow Green peer, has been pushing. So there's these technical ones which are important and we need to push, but what the Green Party really is going to focus on is soil, water and air, which really are the foundational things. And I should just mention one other thing, which is Greenpeace is particularly working on. If you went on their website, I'm sure you'd find some stuff about it, about forest products and other products that we're importing into the UK from places where they're causing massive environmental damage, and strengthening the controls, trying to prevent that happening. At the moment, what's in the law, it's complex, but the shorthand, what's the problem with the law at the moment is it says that companies can't import anything that's illegal, but lots of the worst environmental damage around the world is actually legal under the laws of Brazil or the laws of Indonesia or whatever. So they're calling essentially for environmental bill controls that say, you know, companies have a responsibility to make sure their products aren't trashing the natural environment anywhere in the world. And that's a big leap. We have some progress on that, but we need to see a lot more. So you'll probably hear a lot about that from Greenpeace.
Oh, got another question.
Yep. Can I ask a couple of questions? About the water and sewage, Natalie. I live in West Sussex, where Southern Water is our provider. And yes, our local Green Party, Arran District Green Party, has talked a lot about this sewage stuff. Southern Water were recently fined 90 million pounds for dumping sewage, but they're making 200 million profit per annum, and it still pays them to pay the fine rather than fix the problem, because fixing the problem is going to cost them more than 90 million pounds. So they're going to carry on dumping the sewage and paying the fine. Now, I think that the problem here is obviously because West Sussex is a beautiful place and everybody wants to live here, and houses are popping up left, right and centre, and the infrastructure has not been looked at properly from the word go. And this is why the sewage has not been looked after properly before it got to where it is now. So I don't know what the answer is to this problem, but I know this is the problem. And I think it comes from planning, actually. And who's going to hold the planners to account when there are all these ways of twisting things and getting round things, and as I say, paying 90 million pounds fine rather than fixing the problem because it's the cheaper option. How are we going to fix these kind of things? And talking about what's illegal, are we going to make it illegal to produce anything that damages our water systems? We're still pumping, everybody's washing their dishes with stuff and putting it into the water, washing their clothes and putting it into the water. I've been talking to people about this for years, and yet it's still happening. How can we allow this dangerous stuff to be put into our water every day? How comes we haven't managed to stop that yet? So those are my two questions to you.
Okay, well, I just first of all put an apologies for the background noise. I just voted while listening to you at the same time. I just put a link to, first of all, to the Environment Bill petition from the Green Party, which I urge everyone to sign and share. That link's now in the chat. And I also put a link to my Green World article on water today, and it addresses some of those points you're talking about planning. And the way we use it, the way our buildings are structured, the way even new buildings are structured is incredibly profligate of water. You know, we should not be using drinking water to flush loos. That is an incredibly wasteful use of water. We should be catching the water that runs off the roof, storing that appropriately, using that to flush loos, using that to water gardens, and that should be built into the structure of all new houses. And we should see, you know, you could see a situation where councils have sufficient funding from the central government to supply people very easily with water butts, those sorts of things. And we also need to see the shorthand is SUDS, Sustainable Urban Drainage Systems. So any new development should essentially have no water runoff. And I talk in that article about the Lilac co-housing project in Leeds, which happens to have quite a lot of Green Party members involved in it. But it has a sustainable urban drainage system. You know, it's a very green project, and it has so it essentially has a pond of quite variable heights in the middle of the site, and all the water that runs off the houses that's not caught in water butts and caught for flushing the loos and things runs down into there and gradually, you know, evaporates off over time. It's a place for reeds and wildflowers and wild birds, and you know, it's a lovely natural environment. And so we can't be allowing any new construction that isn't covered by sustainable urban drainage systems. We need to start separating rainwater and sewerage, and we need to stop, producing huge quantities of sewerage in the way that we do. So all of these problems are actually all perfectly technically solvable. These are not technically insurmountable problems. The problem is the nature of planning, the way it's all managed. So again, it's system change, not individual behaviour, that's the core of the problem. Thanks.
Well, in the southern water, actually, we do have surface water drainage, which is different from the sewage. But I can tell you that this winter, because of lockdown, I decided that I'll amuse myself by collecting the water off my roof. There's no way that it's going to fit in a water butt. If I want to keep the water off my roof, I have to dig up my garden and put some tanks under the ground. And even then, I don't know whether I would be able to contain all the water off my roof. The amount of water off a roof is incredible, actually. And yeah, it's a very complicated problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is it's not a case that a water butt contains all of the water off your roof, but if you have a mixture of every house puts in a grey water system for flushing loose water in gardens and water butts and things, if you reduce the volume by 20 or 30%, it's not necessarily all of it, that's a really significant peak surge. And the other thing is, when we talk about flooding, I mean, the buzzword is, or the buzz phrase is, slow the flow. Big problem in terms of water management is when it all hits and lands at once. And if you work all the way along to slow the flow of the rivers, re-meander the rivers, slow the way in which water is moving across the whole landscape, then you reduce the peaks. You have much more steady flow, and that's much easier for water treatment works to cope with. So it's not, you're right, it's not a simple solution.
I think we're reaching the end of our time now. I'm afraid.
One interesting question came in via the chat, and they just yes. So because we're running out of time, but Natalie, what will you be doing at COP26? Do you have a role, or are you protesting?
Well, I mean, it's interesting actually. It didn't really talk very much about what happens at COP26. So there's two sides to COP. There's the people who've spent the whole of the last 2 years working on one sentence of what they hope will be the final COP declaration, and that's the kind of official drafting government side of things. And that's not primarily where I'll be, and it's not where most people will be. What you also have is a giant NGO section, both within the COP venue and lots of fringe places as well. And that's where people talking about all sorts of environmental issues, sometimes only only partly related to climate directly, meet, gather, they lobby their politicians, they hold events, they write about it. So just for example, I've been working a lot with the Stop Ecocide Coalition, and that they'll have quite a large group at COP, and they'll be holding side events, fringe events, trying to get government people along to those, getting other NGOs engaged in the struggle for ecocide. So there's also going to be what's known for shorthand as the Green Hub, and that's the Global Greens, who will be holding a whole series of events involving Greens from around the globe, and it's a mixed virtual physical space. So it's watch out for signs about the Global Greens and the Green Hub. So you might be there hearing a Green from Rwanda and a Green from New Zealand and me talking about a particular issue or something. So a huge amount of COP is that kind of meeting of minds, meeting of the world, discussing the climate issues. And you'll see a lot of outcomes from that. And if you follow my Twitter feed, I'm possibly slightly infamous. I try and often live tweet sessions that I'm at. So I have a friend who complained bitterly about how many slides I had in my Twitter feed. But if you've got a really interesting graph, who can resist putting it out in the Twitter feed? And so for the people who can't be there, just following the COP26 hashtag, you'll get a pretty good sense of a lot of things that are going on. And because we're now also, aware of Zoom and lots of things will be available to anyone anywhere in the world, and lots of things will be taped. So if you follow that hashtag, you're bound to see lots of interesting things that you might like to follow up. So I come back to the point that I've been pushing again and again, making politics what you do, getting involved, getting engaged, telling people about all of this and telling them the good news about how this makes life better. So it seems a good point to finish on.
That was great, Natalie. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to have a T-shirt with "Slow the Flow" written on it, I think. And thank you also to Anna, who's been working hard through all this in the background. Very grateful for her help also. And other than that, I guess we, at the very least, will all be together in spirit in the first week in November, yeah?
Yeah, I've just remembered there is going to be a COP coalition demonstration in Liverpool on the 6th of November. So keep an eye out for that, everybody, as well. And I think there's also a COP coalition group you can join in locally, and they will not be just doing the demo. Once COP's over, they can plan to continue carrying on, putting the pressure on.
Excellent.
Yay.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.